The Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, it was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, peaking in Europe between 1347 and 1351. It's believed to have originated in Asia, traveling along the Silk Road, and finally reaching Europe via the fleas living on the backs of rats that so frequently traveled on merchant ships. The plague mercilessly swept through towns and cities, decimating populations and causing widespread panic and chaos. Estimates suggest the Black Death killed perhaps between 30 and 60% of Europe's total population, leaving a drastically different world in its wake. Hello and welcome to the channel. Well, if you are new here, it's good to meet you, and if you're coming back, you must know what you're in for. As always, if you'd want to support the channel, link to the Patreon is in the description if you like what I do. Otherwise, let us continue on to 10,000 subscribers. Help me out with that with a like and subscribe. Well, with all of that out of the way, let's get on to the real unpleasantries. I'm sure you already know from the introduction perhaps what you're in for. We're going to go on a little bit of a deep dive into the origins of the Black Death, or the bubonic plague, or the Black Plague, or whatever you wish to refer to it as. And then we're going to talk extensively about the consequences. What kind of world was left behind after so much suffering? In fact, it's the world that we live in now. So, I suppose we better understand it. First we'll begin. The term, the Black Death, was not initially used to specifically refer to the 1347 plague in any European language, although it had been used previously to describe fatal diseases. This term, Black Death, started to be associated with this plague in English only in the 1750s. It first appeared to translate the Danish term Den Sort Dod, the Black Death. This label was popularized by Swedish and Danish chroniclers in the 15th and into the early 16th centuries, and was later translated into other languages, including Icelandic and German. Of course, French you'll often see in the artworks Le Mort Noir. Well, before this, many European languages had named the illness with phrases derived from Latin, such as Magna Mortalitas, meaning the Great Death, Magna meaning great, and Mortalitas, you know. Now, this phrase, Black Death, as a description of death being black, actually has some rather ancient roots. For example, Homer even used it in the Odyssey, the very early work from ancient Greece, to describe the monstrous Scylla, whose mouths were full of black death, as the text reads. Seneca the Younger may have been the very first to use Black Death, or in Latin mors atra, to describe an epidemic, emphasizing the severe and grim nature of the disease rather than its color. In the 12th or 13th centuries, French physician Gilles de Corbel used atra mors to refer to pestilential fever in his writings on disease symptoms. Now, the term mors negra, the Black Death, was used by Simon de Covino, a Belgian astronomer, in his 1350 poem On the Judgment of the Sun at a Feast of Saturn. He attributed the plague to an astronomical conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, though his usage does not definitively link to the 1347 plague, and seems to more connotate the deadly outcome of the disease. Now, in the writings from 1893, one historian, Cardinal Francis Aiton Gasquet, suggested the pandemic was a type of the common Eastern or bubonic plague. Later, in 1908, Gasquet referenced that the term atra mors for the 14th century epidemic first appeared in 1361 in a Danish history book by J.I. Pontanus, which he noted, and I quote, "Commonly and from its effects, they called it the Black Death." So how did all this come about? How did it happen that Europe was riddled with this horrible illness? Well, we'll try to trace it back to Genoa. Plague was reportedly first introduced to Europe through the Genoese traders from their port city of Kaffa in Crimea in 1347. During a prolonged siege of the city between 1345 and 46 by the Mongol Golden Horde led by Ani Beg, whose troops were suffering from the disease, they decided to engage in some early chemical warfare. They had the fine idea to hurl the infected corpses via catapults over the walls into the city of Kaffa, attempting to infect the inhabitants. Well, that's one theory, and that did happen, of course. But it's also probable that infected rats crossed the siege lines, contributing to the spread of the epidemic among the residents. Either way, as the plague began to take hold, the Genoese traders fled across the Black Sea to the large city of Constantinople, marking the arrival of the disease in Europe in the summer of 1347. The plague's impact in Constantinople was devastating, claiming the life of the 13-year-old son of the Byzantine Emperor John VI Cantacozenos, who chronicled the disease, drawing parallels to Thucydides' account of the earlier plague of Athens during the 5th century BC. He noted the disease's transmission via ships among maritime cities. Another contemporary, Nicephorus Gregoras, wrote to Demetrius Kidones, describing the escalating death toll and the complete futility of medicine. This, of course, ensued panic among the populace. Well, the initial outbreak in Constantinople lasted about a year, with the plague recurring several times until the year 1400. Of course, each year everybody had to simply wait for that dreaded plague season, and most years it came in varying intensities. The disease had reached Sicily in the October of 1347 aboard 12 Genoese galleys, spreading rapidly across the island. These galleys then proceeded to Genoa and Venice by January 1348, but it was an outbreak in Pisa just a few weeks later that served as the gateway for the plague into northern Italy. By the end of January, one of the galleys expelled from Italy brought the plague to Marseille. From Italy, the plague began to spread across Europe, reaching France, Spain, Portugal, and finally England by June 1348, subsequently spreading through Germany, Scotland, and Scandinavia from 1348 to 1350. It entered Norway in 1349 with a ship that landed at Askøy, spreading further to Bjørgvin, modern-day Bergen, and finally reaching northwestern Russia by 1351. Regions with less established trade networks, such as most of the Basque County, isolated parts of Belgium and the Netherlands, and secluded alpine villages, did experience the plague, yes, but to quite a lesser extent. Epidemiologists suggest that periods of unfavorable weather could have decimated plague-infected rodent populations, pushing their fleas to seek other hosts, which of course led to outbreaks. These outbreaks often peaked during the hot summers of the Mediterranean and the cool autumn months of the southern Baltic regions. Additionally, prevailing malnutrition weakened immune responses, significantly contributing to the vast decline in the European population during this period. Oh, and we have a passage from a contemporary source, by the way, Geoffrey the Baker, in his work Chronicon Angliae, who wrote about the plague thusly. The 7th year after it began, it came to England, and first began in the towns and ports, joining on the sea coast, in Dorsetshire, where, as in other counties, it made the country quite void of inhabitants, so that there were almost none left alive. But at length it came to Gloucester, yea, even to Oxford and to London, and finally it spread all over England, and so wasted the people that scarce the 10th person of any sort was left alive. So you can see from that, not a good situation, Well, by autumn of 1347, the plague had reached Alexandria in Egypt, and that was a huge city, having been transmitted by sea from Constantinople via a merchant ship that was carrying slaves. This marked the beginning of the pandemic's spread through Middle East and North Africa, regions that would see significant depopulation and lasting changes in their economic and social structures. By the late summer of 1348, the plague had reached Cairo, the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, and also a major cultural hub of the Islamic world. Cairo was the largest city in the Mediterranean basin at the time, and the outbreak, of course, had devastating effects, with more than a third of its 600,000 inhabitants dying. Of course, this was indiscriminate. Those numbers included women and children, everybody. Nobody was safe. The child sultan, however, and Nasir Hassan, did manage to flee the city. Despite Cairo's advanced medical facilities, at least for the time, including the medieval hospital of the Calawun complex, the Nile River was practically choked with corpses. The historian Al-Makrizi noted the plague's dramatic impact on Cairo, with an increase in demand for grave diggers and those to perform funeral rites. He reported that the plague recurred in Cairo more than 50 times over the subsequent 150 years. In 1347, the plague spread eastward and reached Gaza, modern-day Palestine, by April, Damascus, modern-day Syria, by July, and Aleppo, also in Syria, by October. Throughout that year, it affected several cities across what is now Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Palestine, including Ascalon, Acre, Jerusalem, Sidon, and Homs. By 1348 to 1349, the disease had reached Antioch, leading to significant population flight northward, with most fleeing residents dying on the journey. Within 2 years, the plague had permeated the entire Islamic world, from Arabia to North Africa, and anybody who fled, who managed to not die on the journey, simply brought plague with them. Simultaneously, the pandemic spread westward from Alexandria along the African coast. By April of 1348, Tunis, modern-day Tunisia, was infected by a ship from Sicily. At the time, Tunis was under siege by a Moroccan army, which, after dispersing in 1348, helped spread the disease to Morocco. Well, it is possible that the epidemic in Morocco was also influenced by interactions with the Islamic city of Almeria in Al-Andalus. In 1348, Mecca experienced an outbreak due to the influx of pilgrims performing the Hajj. The Rasulid Sultan of Yemen, Al-Mujahid Ali, was released from Mamluk captivity in Egypt in 1351 and carried the plague back to Yemen upon his return. Throughout 1349, there are records of a massive epidemic in Mosul and a second significant outbreak in Baghdad, both of these cities being extremely large population centers. So what happens when you get the plague? How do you know? How does it feel? Well, it doesn't feel great. Let's have a look at that. The plague, often characterized by high fever, ranging from 38 to 41 degrees Celsius, about 100 degrees to 106 degrees Fahrenheit, headaches, painful joints, nausea, vomiting, and just a general feeling of illness. Well, all of this came together to prove fatal for approximately 80% of the untreated individuals, and within only 8 days of the symptom onset. 8 very miserable days, by the way. Symptoms noted during the pandemic varied widely, but one of the most common was the appearance of swollen lymph nodes or buboes, particularly in the groin, neck, and armpits. These buboes were basically big welts that would appear on the skin and keep swelling up, frequently oozing with pus and bleeding when opened. Make sure you perhaps don't listen to this video while eating at this point. Well, one of the most vivid contemporary descriptions comes from Boccaccio, who observed that both men and women developed tumors in the groin or armpits, some as large as a common apple, and others as small as an egg. Either way, you do not want them. From these areas, the deadly infection rapidly spread throughout the body. Shortly thereafter, patients would often exhibit black spots or livid patches on their skin, particularly on the arms, thighs, or other parts of the body. These spots varied in size and number, but were considered as ominous as the buboes, predicting the fatality of the infection. Also, contributing to the name, the black spots, the Black Death. You can see how they came to that. Patients typically experienced acute fever and began to vomit blood, succumbing to the disease within 2 to 7 days after these symptoms appeared. Another possible symptom was a rash resembling flea bites, suggesting an additional method of transmission. Beyond the common form of plague, other variants included pneumonic and septicemic plague. Pneumonic plague primarily attacked the lungs, leading to severe respiratory issues, fever, cough, and blood-tinged sputum. As this form of the disease advanced, the sputum turned bright red and became a lot more copious. The mortality rate for pneumonic plague was alarmingly high. If you thought 80% was bad, try between 90 to 95% for the pneumonic plague. I don't like those odds. Well, don't worry, it gets worse. With septicemic plague, which was admittedly less common, but it was nearly almost fatal, with a mortality rate close to 100%. This form manifested through high fevers and skin patches, but this time the patches were purple, resulting from disseminated intravascular coagulation. Unlike the bubonic form, septicemic and particularly pneumonic plague progressed so swiftly that the typical buboes might not even have time to develop. The plague itself is estimated to have killed up to 75 million people, and that's just in the 14th century, a time when the global population was below 500 million. Of course, the death toll figures vary widely, with historical research continuously updating and revising the estimates. In Europe alone, the death toll was of course staggeringly high, with estimates suggesting that between 1/3 and half of the European population perished between 1347 and 1351. Some regions experiencing mortality rates as high as 80%. Contemporary accounts, like those of Jean Froissart, estimated the death toll at 1/3, possibly echoing the biblical allusions of the Book of Revelation to underscore the catastrophic magnitude of the plague. The distribution of deaths across Western Europe was uneven, with some areas experiencing minimal impact, while others faced near total depopulation. The plague disproportionately affected urban centers, where high population densities and unsanitary conditions facilitated the spread of the rapidness of the disease. Major cities like Florence saw their populations drastically reduced. Florence's population, for example, decreased from about 120,000 in 1338 to only 50,000 in 1351. Similarly, Hamburg and Bremen lost 60 to 70% of their populations. In the French regions of Provence, Dauphine, and Normandy, the population decreased by 60%. The town of Givry in Bourgogne recorded an extraordinary number of deaths in 1348, with half of them occurring in September alone. In some parts of Norway, up to 60% of the population perished in the 2 years of 1348 and 1350. London and England in general saw massive declines, with English population plummeting from 7 million to just 2 million by the year 1400. However, Some areas, like the Kingdom of Poland, parts of Hungary, and certain regions within modern Belgium and Spain, initially managed to escape the plague, though they were later affected by subsequent outbreaks. These areas' initial resistance to plague is not really well understood. There's no real explanations for it, but some historians do speculate that genetic factors may have played a role. Either way, when the plague did strike, it struck all social classes, with the lower classes who lived in the more congested and unsanitary conditions being particularly more vulnerable. Notable deaths included monarchs such as Alfonso XI of Castile and Joan of Navarre. The plague also claimed the lives of members of the royal families across Europe, including Peter IV of Aragon's wife and daughter, and Joan of England, daughter of Edward III, who died en route to Spain for her marriage. The Emperor of the Byzantine Empire also lost his son. And in France, Bonne of Luxembourg, the wife of the future John II, succumbed to the disease. The demographic impact of the Black Death in Asia, particularly in China, was also staggering. The region experienced multiple epidemics and famines from the 1200s through the 1350s, culminating in a dramatic population decrease. For example, a severe outbreak in Hubei province in 1334 reportedly claimed up to 80% of the population. Well, overall, China's population declined significantly, from an estimated 125 million to 65 million by the late 14th century. Well, back to Europe, I want to read an account that we have from an Italian chronicler who had the unfortunate experience of experiencing the plague firsthand in Siena in 1348. So here is an account from Agnolo di Tura. Father, abandoned child. Wife, husband, one brother, another. For this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight. And so they died, and none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without divine officers. Great pits were dug and piled beneath with the multitude of the dead. And they died by the hundreds, both day and night. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And there was also those who were sparsely covered with earth, that the dogs dragged them forth, and devoured many bodies throughout the city. There was no one who wept for any death, for all awaited death, and so many died that all believed that it was the end of the world. End of the passage from Agnolo di Tura. In the Middle East, quantifying the exact demographic effects of the plague is a bit of a challenge, mainly due to the scarcity and variability of historical records. Rural areas were particularly hard hit. Many rural inhabitants simply abandoned their homes and livelihoods, leading some regions to being completely depopulated. Urban centers also suffered profound losses. In Gaza, the 1348 outbreak resulted in approximately 10,000 deaths. Aleppo saw death rates as high as 500 people per day during the outbreak, and in Damascus, daily deaths reached a peak of 1,000 during September and October of 1348. By the time the epidemic subsided in the March of 1349, Syria had lost an estimated 400,000 people. Despite these grim figures, the overall mortality rate in the Middle East might have been lower than in some parts of Asia and Europe, potentially less than 1/3 of the total population, according to some scholars. However, this rate varied across different areas, with some locations experiencing much higher mortality rates. In the 14th century, explanations for the causes of the Black Death ranged from the supernatural to the astrological. People were, of course, bewildered and unable to explain what was going on through natural causes. Many believed that such a devastating pandemic simply must be the result of divine wrath, or perhaps the influence of the stars. Giovanni Boccaccio, a contemporary Italian writer, speculated whether the plague was simply a punishment from God, or perhaps the result of some celestial force. Amid all this uncertainty and fear, scapegoating flourished. European Christians concocted all sorts of conspiracy theories, including accusing Jews of poisoning wells and plotting to destroy Christian civilization. These accusations, of course, led to widespread massacres of Jewish communities. The ones that weren't massacres simply got kicked out of whatever city they were in. In one of the most horrific incidents, about 2,000 Jews were massacred in Strasbourg in February of 1349. And later in that year, large Jewish communities in Mainz and Cologne were also completely wiped out. Authorities responded to the crisis in various ineffective, or sometimes even counterproductive ways. Governments enacted measures like banning the export of foodstuffs, instituting price controls on grain, and outlawing large-scale fishing to stabilize prices and maintain supplies. However, these regulations were difficult to enforce, and were, more often than not, just flat-out ignored. Additionally, the prohibition on food exports, combined with widespread crop failures due to a labor shortage caused by the plague, meant that countries like England could neither produce enough grain nor even import it. Consequently, any available grain was often seized by pirates or just sold on the black market. England and France, already depleted by the ongoing Hundred Years' War, which began in around 1337, faced additional strain from inflation, malnutrition, and poverty, marking the continent particularly susceptible to the tragedy of the plague. It's been argued that the Black Death initially had a leveling effect on society. It reduced the population drastically, which in turn increased the value of labor and decreased the value of the land, if, of course, you were around long enough to see it. This shift temporarily reduced economic inequality and improved conditions for the workers. However, the effect was not lasting, as demographic recovery eventually restored the old economic disparities. Moreover, laborers, artisans, and craftsmen saw their real incomes decline in the quarter century following the Black Death due to inflation, despite all of the initial improvements. By 1357, 1/3 of London's properties were vacant due to the severe impact of the plague. The overall population continued to decline until around 1420, complicating efforts to understand the long-term economic impacts of the plague. Additionally, the disruption of trade within the Mongol Empire, exacerbated by the Black Death, is cited as a contributing factor to its eventual decline. The plague significantly impacted the social structure of England and Western Europe, leading to more favorable outcomes for the peasants who survived. The massive population decline had led to social mobility, decreased obligations to remain on traditional land holdings, and the virtual disappearance of serfdom. Land became plentiful, wages rose, and it became possible for individuals, especially younger sons and women, to move about and improve their social status. As population growth resumed, however, these benefits were countered by renewed deprivation and famine. And in Europe, well, they made laws against this sort of thing, which we'll get to in a moment. Well, in a stark contrast, Eastern Europe saw an increase in the stringency of laws, which further tied peasants to the land through intensified serfdom. The reduction in population also led to lower land prices and more available food for the average peasant, contributing to a significant increase per capita income over the following century. With more farmland available for pasture, the consumption of meat and dairy products increased, as did exports of beef and butter from regions like the Low Countries, Scandinavia, and northern Germany. However, the upper classes, well, they couldn't have the peasants making money and improving their lives, now couldn't they? They attempted to resist these social changes by implementing sumptuary laws to prevent peasants from adopting the lifestyles or indeed the appearances of higher social classes with their newfound wealth. Additionally, attempts were made to fix prices and wages to prevent peasants from demanding more due to their increased value. In England, this resistance was formalized in the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which capped peasant wages to pre-plague levels, a measure that contributed to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, and I've done a full video on that, and oh my goodness, it is such a great topic. You owe it to yourself to go and watch that video, or somebody else's video on it. Either way, just learn about the Peasants' Revolt. Well, the plague also led to changes in property ownership, as many land-owning nobles were too dead to really care anymore, and they left their estates to widows and minor children, which may have accelerated the development of new land use practices. But it wasn't all about the people out in the countryside. For urban workers, the plague resulted in a sharp increase in wages. Urban centers had their own labor scarcities. Authorities in Western Europe, including England, attempted to control this through the Ordinance of Labourers Edict in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which of course was one of the laws that froze wages at pre-plague levels. but it also restricted workers' mobility. No more moving around trying to find a better job. No, you have to stay on the plantation. You have to be a good peasant. Well, despite all these efforts, it was simply too hard to enforce. And farm wages in England eventually doubled between 1350 and 1450, although they did remain static until the 19th century. These regulatory efforts may have been less about maintaining wage levels, and more about the elite's fear of the lower class's newfound power and independence. This anxiety was a reaction not just to the economic upheavals, but also to social unrest, including the rather interesting flagellant movement, who, in penance to this perceived curse from God, if we can put it that way, would go around different cities whipping themselves on the back and telling God how sorry they were. Perhaps that will fix the problem. Well, it wasn't just that, of course. The social unrest included this persecution of various groups such as Jews and also Catalans in Sicily, but also beggars, which were seen as this direct consequence of societal stresses induced by the Black Death. The catastrophic population loss stimulated significant technological and agricultural shifts. Labor-saving innovations began to emerge, boosting productivity, and there was this substantial pivot from labor-intensive grain farming to less demanding animal husbandry. This transition was facilitated by the decreased population requiring less farmland, allowing more land to revert to pasture. The widespread deforestation and cultivation that had characterized Europe up until 1200 began to reverse, as abandoned fields simply returned to their natural states. The decimation of the population also accelerated the decline of serfdom in Western Europe. The manorial system, already weakening, was effectively ended in many parts of Western and Central Europe by 1500, simply due to that critical shortage of agricultural laborers caused by the plague. The labor shortage thus led to villages being completely deserted. In England alone, over 1,300 villages were abandoned between 1350 and 1500. Too many bad memories, I suppose. The scarcity of labor then forced landlords to offer better terms of tenure, which, of course, significantly reduced rents across Western Europe. By 1500, a new form of tenure called copyhold emerged, which was a more equitable arrangement, allowing peasants use of the land in return for a fixed annual payment to the landlord, with both parties holding a copy of the agreement. However, serfdom persisted in some parts of Western Europe, and was introduced to Eastern Europe only after the Black Death. Inheritance laws also evolved post-plague. Before the Black Death, typically only the eldest son would inherit property, but the incredible loss of life led to changes which allowed all children, sons and daughters alike, to inherit. Persecutions, of course, increased during and in the wake of the plague, as communities looked for more scapegoats to blame for the devastation. And, as was the style at the time, Jews were often targeted due to their lower infection rates, which some attributed to them being the ones who were putting the poison into the wells. This led to widespread massacres and the destruction of numerous Jewish communities across Europe. But it wasn't just them. There were other marginalized groups, such as friars, beggars, pilgrims, lepers, of course, even just foreigners in general. And don't forget the Romani. They had their share of persecution as well. Women, too, faced increased persecution during this period. In Cairo, for instance, Muslim women were scapegoated for the plague, resulting in restrictive laws prohibiting them from making public appearances to prevent the alleged temptation of men. I fail to see what this has to do with the plague, but, well, that's just the way it is. Well, these laws were only relaxed when the upper classes protested. It made too much of an impact on their domestic arrangements. Well, the Black Death profoundly affected monastic communities, which were often in close contact with the sick who sought refuge there. The disease led to a severe shortage of clergy, as many were simply lost to the epidemic. In response, the process for training clergy was expedited, and new colleges were established at universities to cope with the demand. This often meant that the clergy were hastily trained and lacked the depth of knowledge of their predecessors. Additionally, the shortage of priests opened up new opportunities for lay women, who began to play more significant roles in church services. The period also saw the rise of the flagellants, which I mentioned, groups who engaged in self-flogging as a form of penance, believing that it could atone for the sins and end the plague by showing God how sorry they all were. This movement gained popularity, but faced criticism later for its extreme practices and the eventual hedonism that some members adopted. Despite all the chaos, one group that never really got any criticism was the church. They very rarely got questioned about their handling of the situation. Instead, the societal focus shifted to arts and literature, which took on a more distinctly morbid tone post-1350. Artworks that have shown up through this video, like the Danse Macabre, emerged, depicting skeletons dancing with people from various social classes, symbolizing the universality of death. These images showed the idea that wealth could not prevent the inevitable, a theme that also reflected in the literature of the time. Writers like Boccaccio in Italy vividly described the horror and societal breakdown caused by the plague, emphasizing the massive death toll and overwhelming nature of the epidemic. But among this, a lot of people simply thought, well, we're all going to die. It's the end of the world. Let's all get drunk and party. And that's exactly what they did. In fact, I have a skull that is sitting, not a real one, a skull that is sitting on my bookshelf, which we term a memento mori, remember death. It serves as this reminder of our own mortality. And perhaps if we look at death in this way and have it close by, then we'll utilize our life a little more wisely. Well, in terms of medicine, the Black Death certainly exposed the limitations of the medical knowledge at the time, but it also spurred advances in medical science. There was indeed increased emphasis on anatomical investigations, and the role of surgeons became a lot more prominent. These changes marked a shift towards a more direct engagement with the human body in various states of health. Also, they began to try to move a little bit away from the miasma theory. It took them a while, but there were a few people who were advocating for more modern techniques. See, the miasma theory was essentially linked to bad smells, things like this. You would walk into this cloud and that would not be good for you. Kind of a precursor to bacterial theories, and I don't know much about medicine, but it was kind of on the right track, but not really there yet. Well, another intriguing aspect of the Black Death's impact is its possible influence on genetics. Now, the plague may have played a role in the high frequency of the CCR532 genetic mutation that is among people of European descent, a trait that provides resistance to diseases like HIV and smallpox. While initially thought to be associated with plague resistance, this theory has been challenged by findings that the mutation was just as common in Bronze Age populations. May the 11th, 1348. The city of Pistoia in Italy bravely prepares to confront the Black Death, the highly lethal pandemic ranking among the most devastating in history. Amidst the devastation of the spread of the plague throughout Europe, causing widespread death and societal disintegration, the officials of Pistoia swiftly enacted a set of health regulations in a desperate effort to safeguard their population. This meticulous documentation of these regulations sheds light on how medieval society confronted the atrocities of the pandemic by imposing restrictions on trade, travel, and enforcing quarantine measures. Additionally, they even mandated specific funeral rituals. But despite being centuries away from contemporary medicine, the laws offer an intriguing glimpse into how cities such as Pistoia grappled with the challenge of containing the disease, albeit with the limited knowledge and resources available to them at the time. So, in this video, I'm going to read the entire document and provide a little bit more context about it. But first, let me welcome you to the channel. If you've not been here before, well, it's a pleasure to meet you. For those coming back, it's good to see you again. What do you think about the plague? Why don't you tell me in the comments? And if you provide something very interesting, I may perhaps pin you at the top so everybody can enjoy your observation. Now, without any further ado, let's get straight into it, because I've been looking forward to doing this one for a while. First of all, what exactly is Pistoia? Or rather, where exactly? Well, during the early 14th century, it was a moderately significant city. Not too big, not too small, but depending on the time, it had an urban population ranging from 10 to 15,000, surrounded by a rural population of around 25,000, depending on which estimates. Now, it was situated in the region of Tuscany. That's less than 30 kilometers northwest of Florence, which was, of course, a much larger city, having a population of around 100 to 140,000. Well, during this period, the town was prosperous and had a very strong industrial base. The economy of Pistoia was intimately linked to the industries of Florence, being that it was so close, but it also had an extensive trade with Lucca and exported a significant number of its products through the nearby port of Pisa. The governance of the state was administered by a select executive council, consisting of the elders, who were known as the Anziani, and the Gonfalonier, the standard bearer of justice. Now, the primary executive officials were the captain of the people and the podesta, both of who held the office for 6-month periods. Both of these officers were not actually from Pistoia, but they were sent from the larger city of Tuscany, having a little bit more experience in a larger context, translating into managing a smaller place. But of course, it's not just all about the higher-ups. Let's talk about the people. In fact, the inhabitants had granted these rulers restricted social interaction, and their conduct was heavily scrutinized, or even syndicated, even upon the completion of their terms of duty. This provision granted the right to any individual who believed that they had been treated unfairly by either officer to file charges against them, and often they did. Well, the 8 elders and the standard bearer of justice were chosen by a random selection process from among the city's eligible people who met specific criteria related to age, occupation, and property ownership. They served 2-month periods in their respective positions. The small council engaged in discussions on many matters and provided suggestions to a larger city council known as the Council of the People. Now, this Council of the People had the responsibility to either accept or reject proposals without making any changes to them. It's evident from the ordinances that there were hardly any matters that the government could not discuss that had impact on municipal life. Now, the set of ordinances discussed in today's video pertains to the city's response to the plague, which struck interior Tuscany around March or April of the year 1348. The ordinances were implemented somewhat roughly a month after an outbreak occurred. Now, in terms of Pistoia, Pistoia possesses a more comprehensive and well-preserved collection of city statutes compared to the majority of Italian cities. So this is not to say that other Italian cities did not make precautions or write down specific plans of action. It's just that we are blessed with a very well-preserved and unique account from the Pistoia records. Consequently, we can observe that numerous regulations in Pistoia reiterate the hygienic and general health measures that the city had consistently implemented since earlier times, in fact from the late 12th century. Do remember that the Black Plague, in terms of bubonic plague, those observable symptoms of this illness, was kind of a new thing in its scale, but plagues in general as a blanket term they were not a new thing. Illnesses and these kinds of epidemics were always going on in those days. I dare say will continue to do so for quite some time. Now, the records that we have from Pistoia and from this period in general are actually quite reliable, and it allows us to estimate that Pistoia's urban population had actually decreased by over 50% by 1404, compared to its peak in the late 13th century. Similarly, the rural population had plummeted by more than 70%, just to give you some idea of the devastating consequences. Now, this data should not solely be interpreted as indicating a higher rural mortality rate compared to the metropolitan areas in relation to the plague, but it is probable that after the plague, there was a significant increase in migration from rural areas to urban areas, which had already been happening consistently anyway during the medieval period. Now, this pattern of migration likely contributed to the relative decline of the countryside. However, it's pretty much impossible to determine whether mortality rates were different in the countryside compared to the city. We just don't have the records for the countryside. And it is important to note that most rural residents lived in villages rather than isolated homes. So overcrowding and sanitary issues were likely similar, not as bad, but similar indeed to what you would see in the urban areas, just in a smaller confined space. Now, with that being said, and all of the lovely context added in, let's begin with the actual document. We're going to read it front to back in all of its detail. The document is dated May the 2nd, 1348. In the name of Christ, Amen. Herein are written certain ordinances and regulations made and composed by certain wise people, elected and appointed by the elders and the standard-bearers of justice in order to conserve the health of the human body and restrain and resist various and diverse pestilences which can otherwise befall the human body. And written by me, Simon Buonarcosi, notary, and now notary and scribe of the same wise men deputized through the same Lord's elder, and standard bearer to this writing in the year from the nativity of the Lord 1348 first indiction. These wise men ordered and ordained, first, so that none of the contaminated matter which presently encroaches on the areas surrounding the city of Pistoia can enter the bodies of the citizens of Pistoia. No person, whether citizen or inhabitant of Pistoia or its territory, whether dwelling in said city or environs or territory, wherever they may be, of whatever status, condition, or authority, shall presume to dare to go to Pisa or Lucca by any means, or to their environs or territory or nearby. And no one should or can come from either of them or their environs to said city of Pistoia or its environs or territory, on penalty of 500 pence, accounted in gold, and that the gatekeepers of the city of Pistoia, guarding the gates of the said city, shall not permit those coming or returning to the said city of Pistoia from the said city of Pisa or Lucca, their environs or territory, to enter the said gates on penalty of 10 pence from each of the guards responsible for the gate through which such an entry has been made. It is permitted, however, for citizens now living in Pistoia to go to Pisa and Lucca, their environs or territories, if they first obtain permission from the Common Council, who will vote on the merits of the case presented to them. The license is to be drawn up by the notary of the elders and standard-bearer of the city, and this ordinance is to be upheld and observed from the day of its adoption until the 1st of October, or longer, if the Council sees fit. Note: cancelled on the 23rd of May. Second item. The said wise men ordered that no person, whether citizen, inhabitant, or foreigner, shall dare in any way to bring any used cloth, whether linen or woolen, to the city of Pistoia, its environs or territory, for use as men's or women's clothing or for bedcloths, on penalty of 200 pence. And the cloth is to be burnt in the public piazza of Pistoia by the officials who discovered it. Citizens of Pistoia will be allowed to take linen or woolen cloths with them for their own use or wear, provided that they are in a pack or bundle weighing 30 pounds or less. And this rule shall be observed from the day of its adoption until next January 1st. And if any quantity of cloth of said type or quality has been carried into said city, territory, or environs, the carrier must remove and export it from the said city within 3 days of the adoption of the present ordinance. Same penalty for each carrier or carriers and for each violation. Item 3. They ordered that the bodies of the dead, after they have died, neither should or shall be removed from the place in which they are found, unless first such a body has been enclosed in a wooden casket, covered by a lid secured with nails, so that no stench can issue forth, nor can it be covered by more than one canopy, blankets, or drape, under a penalty of 50 pence, paid by the heirs of the deceased, or, if there are no heirs, by the nearest kinsman in the male line. The goods of the deceased are to stand as surety for the payment of the penalty. Also, such dead bodies of the dead must be carried to the grave only in said casket, same penalty. And so that the aforesaid shall be noted by the rectors and officials of the city of Pistoia, present and future rectors of the parishes of the city of Pistoia, in whose parish there is any dead person, must themselves announce the death and the neighborhood in which the dead person lived to the podesta and the captain or others of the government of said city. They must notify them of this, or pay said penalty for each violation, and the podesta and captain to whom such announcement or notification has been made must immediately send one of their officials to the same location, to see if the contents of the present article and other statutes concerning funerals are being observed, and punish anyone found guilty with the same penalty. The aforesaid shall neither be extended nor enforced upon poor persons, those who are declared to be poor according to the statutes of the city. Item 4. In order to avoid the foul stench that the bodies of the dead give off, they have ordered that any ditch in which a body is to be buried must be dug underground to a depth of 2½ arm lengths by the measure of the city Pistoia, i.e., about 6 feet deep. Item number 5. They have ordered that no person, of whatever condition of status or authority, shall dare to return or carry to the city of Pistoia any dead body, in or out of a casket, or in any manner, on penalty of 25 pence, paid by whoever carries, brings, or orders a body to be carried or brought for each occasion, and that the gatekeepers of the city shall not permit such a body to be brought into the city on penalty of the same fine for each gatekeeper at the gate through which the body was brought. Item 6. They have ordered that any person who will have come for the burial or to bury any dead person neither should nor shall be in the presence of the body itself, nor with the relatives of such a dead person, except for the procession to the church where it will be buried. Nor shall such persons return to the house where the defunct person lived, nor enter into that house or any other house on said occasion, on penalty of 10 pence. Item number 7. They have ordered that when anyone has died, no person should dare to present or send any gift before or after burial to the same former dwelling place of such a dead person, or any other place on the said occasion, or to attend or go to a meal in that house or place on said occasion, on penalty of 25 pence. Children, carnal brothers and sisters, nieces and nephews of such a dead person, and their children, however, shall be exempted from this provision. Item 8. They have ordered that, in order to avoid useless expenses, no person should dare to dress in new clothing during the period of mourning for any dead person, or during the 8 days after that, on penalty of 25 pence for whoever contravenes this, and for each time. Wives of such dead persons, however, shall be exempted. They can be dressed in whatever new clothing they wish, without any penalty. Item 9. They have ordered that no paid mourner shall dare to mourn publicly or privately, or to invite other citizens of Pistoia to go to the funeral or to the dead person, nor may anyone engage said mourner, horn player, crier, or drummer. Item 10. So that the sounds of bells might not depress the infirm nor fear arise in them, the wise men have ordered that the ringers or custodians in charge of the bell tower of the Cathedral of Pistoia shall not permit any bell in the said bell tower to be rung for the funeral of the dead, nor shall any person dare to ring any of these bells on the said occasion. At the chapel or parish of said dead person, or at the friary, if the person is to be buried at a church of the friars, they can ring the bell of the chapel, parish church, or church of the friars, so long as it is rung only one time, and moderately, on the foresaid penalty, in the foresaid manner, for each violation. Item 11. They have ordered that no one shall dare to gather or cause to gather any persons for the purpose of bringing any widow from the former habitation of a dead person, unless at the time she is being returned from the church or cemetery where such a dead person was buried. Blood relatives of such a widow, however, wishing to bring the widow from the house at times other than at the time of burial, may send up to 4 women to accompany the said woman, who is to be brought from the foresaid house of the dead person. Item 12. They have ordered that no person should dare to raise or cause to be raised any wailing or clamor over any person, or because any person who has died outside the city, environs, or territory of Pistoia, nor on the said occasion should any persons be brought together in any place, except blood relatives and associates of such a dead person, nor on the said occasion should any bell be rung or cause to be rung, nor announcements be made throughout the city of Pistoia by mourners, nor on the said occasion should any invitation to join the mourners should be made on a penalty of 25 pence. It must be understood, however, in any written ordinances speaking of the dead and of honouring the burial of the dead, that the aforesaid shall not have force in the burial of the body of any soldiers of the militia, doctors of laws, judges, or physicians, whose bodies, because of their dignity, may be honoured illicitly at burial in a manner pleasing to their heirs. Item 13. So that the bodies of the living will not fall from the putrid or rotten food, no butcher or meatmonger, even in the smallest of amounts, should dare in any way to inflate meat or keep meat inflated, or to sell or arrange to have it kept and sold inflated in his shop over the counter. A penalty of 10 pence to be paid by each butcher and meatmonger for each offence, and the masters of the butchers' guild are bound, for the time being, to investigate and inquire concerning these things on every day that meat is slaughtered. They are to immediately denounce those found culpable to the Lord Podester or Captain, or to any of their officials, same penalty to be paid by the same masters or by any of them, if they or any one of the masters does not arrange for all of the aforesaid things to be carried out. And the podester and captain are each bound for the time being to send one of their officials to inspect and investigate and inquire concerning each and every one of the things contained in this article. And they are to fine and punish with the same penalty those found guilty, and those masters, or any one of them, who does not at once denounce whoever committed these same offences, and the word or report of any official who finds any transgression against this statute is to stand and be believed without any other proof being necessary. Item 14. They have ordered that butchers and retail vendors of meat, individually and in common, neither should nor shall hold or maintain near a tavern or any other place where they sell meats, or near a shop, or besides or behind a shop any stable, pen, or any other thing which will give off a putrid smell, nor can they slaughter meat animals, nor hang them after slaughter in any stable or other place in which there is any stench, on a penalty of 10 pence. Now the following are short ones. It is items 15 to 21. No butcher or meatmonger may display meat at his counter for more than a single ox, calf, or cow at any one time. Between May and August each year, butchers and meatmongers must slaughter and sell meat on each licit day for its consumption of those who wish to eat it. No butcher or meatmonger may slaughter animals without a designated official's approval, who shall confirm its healthy and witness its immediate slaughtering. Between the 1st of March and 1st of December each year, no butcher or meatmonger may slaughter any breeding, mature, or juvenile sow. Between the 1st of December and 1st of March each year, butchers and meatmongers must flay any breeding, mature, or juvenile sow before selling its meat. The official in charge of the correct sale and price of the meat is to be elected by and from among the city's workers and the chapel of San Jacopo. in the cathedral of the low-ranking officials of the city's treasury. For the better preservation of health, no one may export poultry, calves, and other fatty food products from the city, so that stench and putrefaction shall not be harm to men. Henceforth, tanning of hides neither should be done within the city walls of Pistoia, on a penalty of 25 pence. Item 24. For the observance of each and every provision contained in the present articles, and everything in the articles speaking of funerals of the dead, of butchers and retail vendors of meats, they order that the Lord Podesta and Captain and their officials, charged for the time being with said duties, shall and must proceed against, investigate, and inquire concerning all acts contrary to the aforesaid, and cause whatever has been here enacted to be reviewed as often as possible, and punish the guilty by stated fines. Also, any person may accuse or denounce before either the said Podesta or Captain any persons acting against the aforesaid, or any of the content of the said statutes. And such denunciation or accuser may, and will have 1/4 of the fine after it is levied and paid, which fourth part the treasurer pro tem of the treasury of the said city shall have to pay the said to the accuser and informer as soon as the fine and the penalty has been paid. And sufficient proof shall be offered by one witness worthy of belief, or 4 persons of good reputation who have learned of the violation. So that's the main part of the document. But it was revised on the 23rd of May, 1348. So, at the end of the document, we have these little notes on the revisions. Revisions of the 23rd of May. Item 15. It is provided and ordained that, in a restating and correction of the Article 22 of these ordinances, which begins, item, in order that its stench and putridity, etc., and ends for each offence, should be added to, and the added words should be understood as thus, namely, that skinners and tanners of skins should be able, and it is allowed to them, to tan the skins that they have now in their tanneries in the usual manner, which is to take effect from the day of enactment of the present ordinance, i.e. May the 23rd, 1348, until the 15th day of the month of June next to come. Moreover, that henceforth the tanning done, and ought to and can be done within the city walls of Pistoia, but only in the following places, namely, in the houses lining the street and Contrada district from the courtyard, or house of the canons of Pistoia situated in the chapel of Santa Maria del Nuova in the city of Pistoia. Then down the street along which one goes towards the gates of San Pietro and of the said city, up to the vicinity of the said gate, and including the land round about the said gate. And they may stretch out their skins, and do other things necessary for the said tanning process, as it pleases them, in the aforesaid places. And tanning should be done, and ought to and can be done in the place below the Castel Trajecti, up to and in the vicinity of the Carmelite Friary of Santa Maria del Monte, and in the houses and courtyards and land situated in the said places. and anyone who goes against the aforesaid stipulations, or against any one of them, is to be fined and punished for each offence, according to the penalty contained in this said article of the said ordinances. It is providing and ordained in order that no putridity and stench can harm human bodies, that the rendering down of dripping or suet be done, or ought to be done, in a house or houses at least 25 arm lengths, i.e. 50 to 60 feet, from other houses in the city of Pistoia, and not elsewhere. Penalty of 25 pence from each offender, and for each offence. It is provided and ordained that the tanning of gut, from which strings are made, is to be done and ought to be done outside the city of Pistoia, and not within the city itself, and the offender is to be fined and punished 25 pence for each offence. End of the document. Interesting, that last little part talking about the gut strings. Now, I'm a guitar player myself. You might have seen that the nails on my right hand are longer than the left. Well, that's for classical guitar. Of course, it's very hard to get gut strings these days, but you can still get them. Sort of have to buy them off the internet, though. Not many guitar shops have them as the standard stock. I believe you can get the frets as well. Same for violin strings and all the rest. Well, that is the end of the document. I'm sure there's plenty of people around who are thinking, well, thankfully that's all over, no more plague for us. Well, I have some bad news for you. I'm afraid you're mistaken. The plague isn't just a thing of the past. It's very much still with us today. Now, that being said, we don't have to look over our shoulders too much. We're quite lucky to be blessed with the modern medicine and hygienic luxury, at least in most parts of the world. But the plague goes where it goes, and it finds a way in. Now, Madagascar, for instance, that's that little island off the coast of Africa, they had their own bout of plague in 2017, in which out of 2,417 cases, there were actually 209 people who actually died from it. You imagine dying from the bubonic plague in 2017. What a way to go. But of course, that's all the way in Madagascar. Far, far away from you, right? No need to worry. Well, once again, not so fast. I did do a little bit of digging around, and it didn't take me too long to find that actually on the 13th of February, just this year, 2024, some 6 or 7 months ago, there was a news article that was published by The Guardian. I know, right? The Guardian. About a man in the state of Oregon, USA, who came down with the plague. And back in 2012, an unfortunate man also caught the plague in Oregon when he was pulling a dead rat out of his choking cat's mouth. What on earth is going on in Oregon? Well, there was another teenager from Colorado who also came down with it. In fact, last year in Colorado, that state of the USA, officials recorded 2 official deaths from the Black Plague. You didn't hear about that one on the news, didn't you? Of course, they probably don't want to panic people. Now, out of curiosity, too, if you go onto the CDC website, they actually have a page there that is dedicated on ways to protect yourself from the bubonic plague. It all sounds a little ridiculous, but like I said, it's still with us, but just in this diminished capacity. So, I am going to do you the favor and tell you exactly what the CDC wants you to hear, the Center for Disease Control, about how you can avoid getting the plague, because I do not want to lose any subscribers, especially to something like that. So, the first tip: reduce rodent habitat around your home, workplace, and recreational areas. Remove brush, rock piles, junk, cluttered firewood, and possible food supplies for rodents, such as pet and wild animal food. Make your home and outbuildings rodent-proof. Well, that's a pretty good tip. Next one. Wear gloves if you are handling or skinning potentially infected animals to prevent contact between your skin and the plague bacteria. Contact your local health department if you have questions about the disposal of dead animals. Next tip. Use repellent if you think you could be exposed to fleas during activities such as camping, hiking, or working outdoors. Products containing DEET can be applied to the skin as well as clothing, and products containing the permethrin can be applied to clothing too. Also follow the instructions on the label always. Keep fleas off of your pets by applying flea control products. Animals that roam freely are more likely to come into contact with plague-infected animals or fleas and could bring them into homes. If your pet becomes sick, seek care from a veterinarian as soon as possible. Do not allow dogs or cats that roam free in endemic areas to sleep on or in your bed. Note: a plague vaccine is no longer available in the United States. New plague vaccines are in development, but are not expected to be commercially available in the near future. And that's the end of the advice from the disease control website. Oh, seems pretty simple, right? Well, those who are dog owners and cat owners, perhaps make sure you're keeping all those flea medications up. Well, if you are so unlucky to get it, what do? Well, these days, we just use antibiotics. It's pretty easy. If you are in a country that has extra antibiotics to go around, hopefully you are. Hello and welcome. Today we're going to discuss 3 of the primary sources regarding the Black Death in Europe, told by those who were unfortunate enough to be there at the time. The first is one of Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived from 1317 to 1375, somewhat of a quintessential account in his work The Decameron. And so, let's begin. If you like this kind of content, like and subscribe, you know the drill. Nice and relaxed, shall we? The account of Giovanni Boccaccio from the Decameron. I say, then, that the years of the beatific incarnation of the Son of God had reached the tale of 1348, when in the illustrious city of Florence, the fairest of all the cities of Italy, there made its appearance that deadly pestilence, which, whether disseminated by the influence of the celestial bodies, or sent upon us mortals by God in his just wrath by way of retribution for our iniquities, had its origins some years before in the East, whence, after destroying an innumerable multitude of living beings, it had propagated itself without respite from place to place, and so calamitously had spread into the West. In Florence, despite all that human wisdom and forethought could devise to avert it, as the cleansing of the city from many impurities by officials appointed for the purpose, the refusal of entrance to all sick folk, and the adoption of many precautions for the preservation of health, despite also humble supplications addressed to God, and often repeated both in public procession and otherwise by the devout, towards the beginning of the spring of the said year, the doleful effects of the pestilence began to be horribly apparent by symptoms that showed as if miraculous. Not such were they in the East, where an issue of blood from the nose was a manifest sign of inevitable death. But in men, a woman alike, it first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groin or the armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg, some more, some less, which the common folk called gaviccioli. From the two said pairs, the body, this deadly gaviccioli, soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently, after which the form of the malady began to change, black spots, or livid, making their appearance in many cases on the arm or the thigh or elsewhere, now few and large, then minute and numerous. And as the gaviccioli had been and still were infallible tokens of approaching death, such also were the spots on whomsoever they showed themselves. Which maladies seemed set entirely at naught both the art of the physician and the virtue of the physic. Indeed, whether it was that disorder was a nature to defy such treatment, or that the physicians were at fault. Besides the qualified, there was now a multitude of both men and of women who practiced without having received the slightest tincture of medical science, and being in ignorance of its source, failed to apply the proper remedies. In either case, not merely were those that covered few, but almost all within 3 days from the appearance of the said symptoms, sooner or later, died, and in most cases, without any fever or other attendant malady. Moreover, the virulence of the pest was the greater reason by the intercourse was apt to convey it from the sick to the whole, just as fire devours things dry or greasy. When they are brought close to it, the evil went yet further, for not merely by speech or association with the sick was that malady communicated to the healthy with consequent peril of common death, but any that touched the clothes of the sick, or aught else that had been touched, or used by these, seems thereby to contract the disease. So marvellous sounds, that which I have now to relate, that had not many, and I among them, observed it with their own eyes, I had hardly dared to credit it, much less to set it down in writing, though I had had it from the lips of credible witnesses. I say then, that such was the energy of the contagion of the said pestilence, that it was not merely propagated from man to male, but, what is much more startling, it was frequently observed that things which had belonged to one sick or dead of the disease, if touched by some other living creature, not of the human species, were the occasion not merely of sickening, but of almost instantaneous death, whereof my own eyes, as I said a little before, had cognizance, one day among others, by following the experience. The rags of a poor man who had died of the disease being strewn about the open street, 2 hogs came thither, and after, as is their wont, no little trifling with their snouts, took the rags between their teeth and tossed them to and fro about their chaps. Whereupon, almost immediately, they gave a few turns, and fell down dead, as if by poison, upon the rags which in an evil hour they had disturbed. In which circumstances, not to speak of many others of a similar or even greater complexion, divers apprehensions and imaginations were engendered in the minds of such as were left alive, inclining almost all of them to the same harsh resolution, to wit, to shun and abhor all contact with the sick and all that belonged to them, thinking thereby to make each his own health secure. Among whom there were those who thought that to live temperately and avoid all excesses would count for much as a preservative against seizures of this kind. Wherefore they banded together, and dissociating themselves from all others, formed communities in houses where they were no sick, and lived a separate and secluded life, which they regulated with utmost care, avoiding every kind of luxury, but eating and drinking moderately of the most delicate viands and the finest wines, holding converse with none but another, lest tidings of sickness or death should reach them, and diverting their minds with music and such other delights as they could devise. Others, the bias of whose minds was in the opposite direction, maintained that to drink freely, frequent places of public resort, and to take their pleasure with song and revel, sparingly to satisfy no appetite, and to laugh and mock at no event, was the sovereign remedy for such a great evil. And that which they affirmed they also put into practice, so far as they were able, resorting day and night, now to this tavern, now to that, drinking with an entire disregard of rule or measure, and by preference making the houses of others, as it were, their inns, if they but saw in them aught that particularly was to their taste or liking, which they were readily able to do, because the owners, seeing death imminent, had become as reckless of their property as of their lives, so that most of these houses were open to all comers, and no distinction was observed between the stranger who presented himself and the rightful lord. Thus, adhering ever to the inhuman determination to shun the sick as far as possible, they ordered their life. In this extremity of our city's suffering and tribulation, the venerable authority of laws human and divine was abased, and all but totally dissolved for lack of those who should have administered and enforced them, most of whom, like the rest of the citizens, were either dead or sick, or so hard-bested for servants that they were unable to execute any office, whereby every man was free to do what was right in his own eyes. Not a few there who belonged to neither of the two said parties, but kept a middle course between them. neither laying the same restraint upon their diet as the former, nor allowing themselves the same license in drinking or other dissipations as the latter, but living with a degree of freedom sufficient to satisfy their appetite, and not as recluses. They therefore walked abroad, carrying in the hands flowers or fragrant herbs or divers sorts of spices which they frequently raised to their noses, deeming it an excellent thing thus to comfort the brain with such scents and perfumes, because the air seemed everywhere laden with the reeking stench emitted by the dead and dying, the odors of drug. But some, again, the most sound perhaps in judgment, as they were also the most harsh in temper of all, affirmed that there was no medicine for the disease superior or equal in effective to flight. Following which prescription, a multitude of men and women, negligent of all but themselves, deserted their cities, the houses, their estates, their kinsfolk, everything they had, and thus went into voluntary exile, or migrated to the country parts as if God, visiting men with this pestilence in requital of their iniquities, would not pursue them with his wrath, wherever they might be, but intending the destruction of such alone as remained within the circuit of the walls of the city, or deeming, perchance, that it was now time for all to flee from it, and that its last hour had come. Of the adherents of all these diverse opinions, not all died, neither did all escape, but rather there were each sort in every place many that sickened, and by those who retained their health were treated after the example which they themselves while whole had set, being everywhere left to languish in almost total neglect. Tedious were it to recount how citizen avoided citizen, how among neighbors was scarce found that any showed fellow feeling for each other, how kinsfolk held aloof, and never met, or but rarely, enough that this sore affliction entered so deep into the minds of men and women, that in the aura, therefore, brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by nephew, brother by sister, uncle by aunt, and oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited to their fate, as if they had been complete strangers. Whereof the sick both sexes, whose number could not be estimated, were left without resource but in the charity of friends, and few such there were, or the interest of servants, who were hardly to be had at high rates, and on unseemly terms, and being moreover one and all men and women of gross understanding, and for the most part unused to such offences, concerned themselves no further than to supply the immediate and expressed wants of the sick, and to watch them all die, in which service they themselves not seldom perished with their gains. In consequence of which dearth of servants and dereliction of the sick by the neighbours, kinsfolk, and friends, it came to pass a thing, perhaps, never before heard of, that no woman, however dainty, however fair, or however well born she might be, shrank, when stricken with disease, from the ministrations of a man, no matter whether he were young or not, or scrupled to expose to him every part of her body, with no more shame than if he had been a woman, submitting to necessity of that which the malady required, wherefrom, perchance, there resulted in after some time some loss of modesty in such as recovered, besides which many succumbed, who with proper attendance would perhaps have escaped death, so that, with the virulence of the plague and the lack of due attendance to the sick, the multitude of deaths that daily and nightly took place in the city was such that those who heard the tale, not to say witnessed the fact, that were struck dumb with amazement, whereby practices contrary to the former habits of the citizens could hardly fail to grow up among the survivors. It had been, as to this day it still is, for the women that were neighbors and of kin to the deceased to gather in his house, with the women that were most closely connected to him, to wail with them in common, while on the other hand his male kinsfolk and neighbors, with not a few of the other citizens and a due proportion of the clergy according to his quantity, assembled without, in front of his house, to receive the corpse, and so the dead man was borne on the shoulders of his peers, with funeral pomp and tapper and dirge, to the church selected by him before his death, which rites, as the pestilence waxed in fury, were either in whole or in great part discussed, and gave way to others of a novel order. For not only did no crowd of women surround the bed of the dying, but many passed from this life unregarded, and few indeed were they to whom were accorded the lamentations and bitter tears of sorrowing relations. Nay, for the most part, their place was taken by the laugh, the jest, the festal gathering, observances which the woman domestic piety in large measure set aside, had adopted with very great advantage to their health. Few also were there whose bodies were attended to the church by more than 10 or 12 of their neighbors, and those not the honorable and respected citizens, but a sort of corpse carrier drawn from the baser ranks, who called themselves Becini, and performed such offices for hire, would shoulder the bearing, and with hurried steps carry it, not to the church of the dead man's choice, but to that which was nearest at hand, where 4 or 6 priests in front of a candle or 2, or perhaps none, nor did the priests distress themselves with too long and solemn an office, but with the aid of the Becini, hastily consigned the corpse to the first tomb which they found unattended. The condition of the lower, and perhaps in great measure of the middle ranks of the people, showed even worse and more deplorable, for, deluded by hope and constrained by poverty, they stayed in their quarters, in their houses, where they sickened by thousands a day, and, being without service or help of any kind, were, so to speak, irredeemably devoted to the death which overtook them. Many died daily or nightly in the public streets, and many others, who died at home, their departure was hardly observed by their neighbors, until the stench of their putrefying bodies carried the tidings, and what with their corpses, and the corpses of others who died on every hand, the whole place was a sepulchre. It was the common practice of most neighbors, moved no less by fear of contamination by the putrefying bodies than by charity towards the deceased, to drag corpses out of the houses with their own hands, aided perhaps by a porter, if a porter was to be had, and to lay them in front of the doors, where anyone who made the round might have been seen, especially in the morning, more of them than he could count. Afterwards, there would have been biers brought up to or in default planks where they laid them upon. Nor was it once, twice, that one on the same bier carried 2 or 3 corpses at once, but quite a considerable number of such cases occurred. 1 bier sufficing for husband and wife, 2 or 3 brothers, father and son, and so forth. And times without number it happened that as 2 priests bearing the cross were on their way to perform the last office for some time, 3 or 4 biers were brought up by the porters in the rear of them, so that whereas the priests supposed that they had but 1 corpse to bury, they discovered that there were 6 or 8, or sometimes even more. Nor for all their number were their obsequies honored by either tears or lights or crowds of mourners. Rather, it was come to this, that a dead man was then of no more account than a dead goat would be of today. End of the account from Giovanni Boccaccio, from the work The Decameron. Pretty scary, huh? Well, some of the language is a little bit dated, I'm sure, but we really should remain faithful to the source material. Now, let's move on, as we have another account. And this one is a little short, but it's interesting. It is from the great traveler Ibn Battuta. If you've not heard of him, I've done a full video on him. Quite fascinating. Pretty much walked for a very, very long time, if we want to boil it down to that. Now, he was around in 1348 in Damascus, which of course at the time, with crusades going on and all the rest, was always fought over back and forth between the Eastern powers and the Western powers, or we could just say the Christians and the Muslims, with the occasional Mongol interference. Well, we're lucky enough that we still have his account, as he kept quite an extensive journal, and this is what he wrote about experiencing the scenes of the plague in 1348 in that city of Damascus, modern-day Syria. One of these celebrated sanctuaries at Damascus is the Mosque of the Footprints, Al-Akhdam, which lies 2 miles south of the city, alongside the main highway which leads to the Hijaz, Jerusalem, and Egypt. It is a very large mosque, very blessed, richly endowed, and very highly venerated by the Damascens. The footprints from which it derives its name are certain footprints impressed upon a rock there, which are said to be those marking Moses' feet. In this mosque there is a small chamber containing a stone with the following inscription: "A certain pious man saw in his sleep the chosen one Muhammad, who said to him, 'Here is the grave of my brother Moses.'" I saw a remarkable instance of veneration in which the Damascens hold this mosque during the great pestilence on my return journey through Damascus in the latter part of July 1348. The Viceroy Argun Shah ordered a crier to proclaim through Damascus that all people should fast for 3 days, and that no one should cook anything edible in the market during the daytime. For most of all people, there eat no food, but what had been prepared in the market. So the people fasted for 3 successive days, the last of which was a Thursday. Then they assembled in the great mosques amirs, sharifs, qadis, theologians, and all other classes of people until the place was filled to overflowing, and there they spent the Thursday night in prayers and litanies. After the dawn prayer the next morning, they all went out together on foot, holding Korans in their hands, and the amirs barefooted. The procession was joined by the entire population of the town, men and women, small and large. The Jews came with their book of the law and the Christians with their gospel, all of them with their women and children. The whole concourse, weeping and supplicating, and seeking the favor of God through his book of prophets, made their way to the mosque at the footprints, where they remained in supplication and in invocation until near midday. They then returned to the city and held the Friday service, and God lightened their affliction, for the number of deaths in a single day at Damascus did not attain 2,000, while in Cairo and Old Cairo it reached the figure of 24,000 a day. End of the account from Ibn Battuta. What'd you think of that one, Well, we've got another one for you, and this time we go back to Florence, back to Italy. It's a little bit of a later account, kind of a retrospect, from one Marcione di Copo Stefani in a work called the Florentine Chronicle, which was written around the 1370s. So let's begin. In the year of our Lord, 1348, there was a very great pestilence in the city and district of Florence. It was of such a fury, and so tempestuous, that in houses in which it took hold, previously healthy servants who took care of the ill died of the same illness. Almost none of the ill survived past the 4th day. Neither physicians nor medicines were effective, whether because these illnesses were previously unknown or because physicians had not previously studied them. There seemed to be no cure. There was such a fear that no one seemed to know what to do. When it took hold in a house, it often happened that no one remained who had not died. And it was not just that men and women died, but even sentient animals died. Dogs, cats, chickens, oxen, donkeys, sheep showed the same symptoms and died of the same disease. And almost none, or very few who showed the symptoms, were cured. The symptoms were the following: a bubo in the groin, where the thigh meets the trunk, or a small swelling under the armpit, sudden fever, spitting blood and saliva, and no one who spat blood survived it. It was such a frightful thing that when it got into a house, as was said, no one remained. Frightened people abandoned the house and fled to another. Those in town fled to villages. Physicians could not be found, because they had died like the others. And those who could be found wanted vast sums in hand before they entered the house. And when they did enter, they checked the pulse with face turned away. They inspected the urine from a distance, and with something odoriferous under their nose. Child abandoned father. Husband abandoned wife. Wife the husband. One brother the other. One sister the other. In all the city, there was nothing to do but to carry the dead to burial, and those who died had neither confessor nor sacraments, and many died with no one looking after them. And many died of hunger, because when someone took to bed sick, another in the house, terrified, said to him, "I'm going for the doctor." Calmly walking out the door, the other left and never returned. Abandoned by the people, without food, but accompanied by fever, they weakened. There were many who pleaded with their relatives not to abandon them when night fell. But the relatives said to the sick person, "So that during the night you did not have to awaken those who serve you and who work hard day and night, take some sweetmeats, wine, or water. They are here on the bedstead by your head. Here are some blankets." And when the sick person had fallen asleep, they left, and they did not come back. If it happened that he was strengthened by the food during the night, he might be alive and strong enough to get to the window. If the street was not a major one, he might stand there a half-hour before anyone came by. And if someone did pass by, if he was strong enough that he could be heard when he called out to them, sometimes there might be a response, and sometimes not. But there was no help. No one, or few, wished to enter a house where anyone was sick. Nor did they even want to deal with those healthy people who came out of a sick person's house, and they said to them, "He is stupefied, do not speak to him," saying further, "He has it because there is a bubo in his house." They call this swelling a bubo. Many died unseen, so they remained in their beds until they stank, and the neighbors, if there were any, having smelled the stench, placed them in a shroud and sent them for burial. Their house remained open, and yet there was no one daring enough to touch anything, because it seemed that things remained poisoned, and that whoever used them picked up the illness. At every church, or at most of them, they dug deep trenches, down to the waterline, wide and deep, depending on how large the parish was. And those who were responsible for the dead carried them on their backs in the night in which they died and threw them into the ditch. Or else they paid a high price to those who would do it for them. The next morning, if there were many bodies in the trench, they covered them over with dirt, and then more bodies were put on top of that, with a little more dirt over those. They put layer on layer, just as one puts layers of cheese in a lasagna. The becciamorti, literally vultures, who provided their service, were paid such a high price that many were actually enriched by it. Many died from carrying away the dead, some rich, some after earning just a little. But the high prices continued. Servants, or those who took care of the ill, charged from 1 to 3 florins per day, and the cost of things grew. The things that the sick ate, sweetmeats and sugar, seemed priceless. Sugar costs from 3 to 8 florins per pound, and other confections cost similarly. Capons and other poultry were expensive, and eggs cost between 12 and 24 pence each. And he was blessed who could find 3 per day, even if he searched the entire city. Finding wax was miraculous. A pound of wax would have gone up more than a florin if there had not been a stop put by the communal government to the vain ostentation that the Florentines always make over funerals. Thus it was ordered that no more than 2 large candles could be carried in any funeral. Churches had no more than a single bier, which usually was not sufficient. Spice dealers and becamorti sold biers, burial pals, and cushions at very high prices. Dressing in expensive woolen cloth, as is customary in mourning the dead, that is, in a long cloak, with a mantle and veil that used to cost the women 3 florins, climbed in price to 30 florins, and would have climbed to 100 florins had the custom of dressing in expensive clothing not been changed. The rich dressed in modest woolens. Those not rich sewed clothes in linen. Benches on which the dead were placed cost like the heavens, and still the benches were only 1/100th of those needed. Priests were not able to ring any bells, as they would have liked. Concerning that, the government issued ordinances discouraging the sound of bells, sale of burial benches, and limiting expenses. They could not sound bells, sell benches, nor cry out announcements, because the sick hated to hear this, and it discouraged the healthy as well. Priests and friars went to serve the rich in great multitudes, and they were paid such high prices that they all got rich, and therefore the authorities ordered that one could not have more than a prescribed number of clerics in the local parish church, and the prescribed number of friars was 6, all fruits with a nut at the centre like unripe plums and unhusked almonds, fresh broad beans, figs, and every useless and unhealthy fruit were forbidden entrance to the city. Many processions, including those with relics and the painted tablet of Santa Maria Impruneda, went through the city crying our mercy and praying, and then they came to a stop in the piazza of the Priors. There they made peace concerning important controversies, injuries, and deaths. This pestilence was a matter of such great discouragement and fear that men gathered together in order to take some comfort in dining together. And each evening one of them provided dinner to 10 companions, and the next evening they planned to eat with one of the others. And sometimes, if they planned to eat with a certain one who had no meal prepared because he was sick, or if the host had made dinner for the 10, 2 or 3 were missing, some fled to villas, other to villages, in order to get a change of air. Where there had been no pestilence, there they carried it. If it was already there, they caused it to increase. None of the guilds in Florence was working. All the shops were shut, taverns closed. Only the apothecaries and churches remained open. If you went outside, you found almost no one, and many good and rich men were carried from home to church on a pall by 4 becciamorti, and 1 tonsured clerk who carried the cross. Each of them wanted a florin. This mortality enriched apothecaries, doctors, poultry vendors, becciamorti, and greengrocers, who sold all sorts of poultices of mallow, nettles, mercury, and other herbs necessary to draw off the infirmity. And it was those who made these poultices who made a lot of money. Wool workers and vendors of remnants of cloth who found themselves in possession of cloths after the death of the entrepreneur for whom they were working, sold it to whoever asked for it. When the mortality ended, those who found themselves with cloth of any kind, or with raw materials for making cloth, was enriched. But many found, who actually owned cloths being possessed by the workers, found it to be moth-eaten, ruined or lost by the weavers. Large quantities of raw and processed wool were lost throughout the city and countryside. The pestilence began in March, as was said, and ended in September of 1348, and people began to return to look after their houses and possessions. And there were so many houses full of goods without a master that it was stupefying. Then those who would inherit these goods began to appear, and such it was by those who had nothing found themselves rich with what did not seem to be theirs, and they were unseemly because of it. Women and men began to dress ostentatiously. How many of the dead died because of the mortality of the year of Christ, 1348? Now it was ordered by the bishop and the lords of the city government that they should formally inquire as to how many died in Florence. When it was seen at the beginning of October that no more persons were dying of the pestilence, they found that among males, females, children, and adults, 96,000 died between March and October. How they passed ordinances concerning many things in Florence. In the said year, when the mortality stopped, women and men in Florence were unmindful of traditional modest clothing, their dress. Ordinances were passed concerning this, giving the authority to the judge of Gracia to enforce these ordinances. The tailors made such boundless demands for payment that they could not be satisfied. Authority was granted to the judge that he should handle all matters himself. Servants were so unhappy about the very high prices they paid that it was necessary to make great efforts to restrain the price rises. The workers on the land in the countryside wanted rent contracts, such that you could say all the harvest would be theirs. And they learned to demand oxen from the landlord, but at the landlord's risk and liability for any harm done to the animal. And then they helped others for the pay by the job or by the day. And they also learned to deny liability for loans and rental payments. Concerning this, serious ordinances were instituted, and hiring laborers became much more expensive. You could say that the farms were theirs, and they wanted the oxen, seed, loans, quickly, and on good terms. It was necessary to put a brake on weddings as well, because when they gathered for the betrothal, each party brought too many people in order to increase the pomp. And thus, the wedding was made up of so many trappings. How many days were necessary, and how many women took part in a woman's wedding? And they passed many other ordinances concerning these issues. End of the account. The Great Plague of London, 1665 to 66. One of the final major epidemics of the bubonic plague to hit England, taking out an estimated 100,000 people, almost a quarter of the population of London at the time. The outbreak began in the poor and densely populated parish of St. Giles in the Fields, before spreading rapidly throughout the city. It was part of the larger pandemic that affected various parts of Europe, caused by Yersinia pestis, the bacterium associated with other plague outbreaks, including the infamous Black Death. The city's response included quarantine measures, the killing of stray animals, and the use of plague doctors who treated victims with often dubious methods. The plague dwindled during the winter of 1666, due in part to the Great Fire of London, which inadvertently helped end the outbreak by destroying many of the overcrowded, rat-infested urban slums that had allowed the disease to thrive in the first place. Hello and welcome to the channel. If it's your first time here, it's good to meet you, and if you're coming back, good to have you with me again. Well, if you'd like to support the channel, you're already doing it. If you want to go above and beyond, you may refer to the description of the video. Now, I'm sure you have seen my previous video on the Black Death. If you would like to go and watch that, you'll find it in the medieval playlist. If not, let's continue, get nice and comfortable, as we talk about the Great Plague of London. Let's set the scene first. In the 17th century, London, like many European cities, was frequently afflicted by the plague. The disease had claimed around 30,000 lives in 1603, 35,000 in 1625, and 10,000 in 1636, with additional outbreaks causing further deaths in other years. It was a normal part of life, an unpleasant one, but an experience quintessential to being in medieval times. By late 664, the appearance of a bright comet had stirred fear among the populace of London, leading to widespread speculation about impending calamities. The city itself was densely packed into about 448 acres, encircled by ancient walls designed originally to fend off raiders and bordered to the south by the mighty River Thames. Key entry points through the city wall included the gates at Ludgate, Newgate, Aldersgate, Cripplegate, Moorgate, Bishopsgate, and Aldgate, while the Thames could be crossed via the London Bridge. Of course, sanitary conditions one would expect in the poorer districts were deplorable, to say the least. Overcrowded tenements and garrets made cleanliness completely unattainable. Streets lacked sanitation, with open drains carrying filth along their lengths. The streets, muddied and littered with animal droppings, household waste and sewage, presented a dire public health hazard. During the summer, the refuse of course attracted swarms of flies, and in the winter the streets were awash with human waste. To mitigate the worst of this pollution, the city corporation employed rakers who would clear the filth and transport it to heaps outside the city walls, where it would, of course, continue to decompose, contributing to the pervasive, overpowering stench, certainly always downwind of that. Many residents resorted to carrying handkerchiefs or nosegays to cover their nostrils, often stuffed with a few flowers to try and ease the stench. Transportation, of course, within the city was chaotic and congested, a very grim situation. While some goods like coal arrived by barge down the Thames, most supplies and traffic moved via the congested and dirty roads, and of course they moved by horses. And the more horses, well, you know. The city's gateways created bottlenecks as well, severely hampering movement, and the 19-arch London Bridge was notorious for its overcrowding. Affluent individuals often travelled in hackney carriages or sedan chairs to avoid the filth, while the less fortunate walked and risked being splashed with dirty water from the roads, slops discarded from the second stories of homes, or runoff from roofs, or perhaps even worse things being thrown out from chamber pots. Adding to the urban miasma was the choking black smoke emitted from the many factories, breweries, iron smelters, and the coal burned in approximately 15,000 dank and dingy homes. During the 17th century, London's rapid expansion pushed its boundaries beyond those ancient city walls, leading to the emergence of densely populated shanty towns. These makeshift neighborhoods, largely devoid of sanitation, were hastily constructed to accommodate the influx of artisans and tradespeople drawn to the bustling city. Despite government efforts to restrict their growth, these suburbs housed over 250,000 people. The political turmoil of the Commonwealth era saw many loyalists fleeing Britain, leaving behind numerous townhouses. These buildings were quickly occupied by newcomers, who transformed them into overcrowded tenements, where multiple families shared single rooms, leading to dilapidated conditions and rampant rat infestations. The City of London was managed by the Lord Mayor, aldermen, and common councillors, but its authority did not extend to the entire metropolitan area. Surrounding the walled city were districts known as liberties, self-governing areas often linked historically to religious institutions dissolved during the earlier dissolution of the monasteries. Their secular successors retained these governance rights. By 1665, these liberties formed a protective ring known as the City and Liberties, encompassing the immediate outskirts of London. However, beyond this area lay further suburbs with their own local governance. Westminster, for example, had developed into an independent town with its own set of liberties, seamlessly connected to London through urban sprawl. Similarly, the Tower of London operated independently. Areas outside these specific jurisdictions fell under the counties of Middlesex or Surrey, depending on their location relative to the River Thames. At the time, the bubonic plague, a feared scourge, was rampant, though its origins and transmissions were mysteries still wrapped in great many layers of medieval superstition. In fact, many attributed the plague to noxious vapors from the earth, that old miasma theory, strange weather, or even unusual animal behavior. It was not until the late 19th century that Alexandre Yersin pinpointed Yersinia pestis as the bacterial culprit, with rat fleas identified as the primary vector. The definitive link between Yersinia pestis and the Great Plague of London was only established through DNA analysis in 2016, suggesting that human bodily lice may have played more significant roles in spreading the plague than previously thought. Well, to assess the impact of an epidemic accurately, it's crucial to understand the population size at risk. I mean, it's all relative. The numbers are only relative to percentages, don't you think? In the 17th century, London lacked an official census, leaving estimates based on the work of pioneering demographer John Graunt, who lived from 1620 to 74. A fellow of the Royal Society, Graunt applied a scientific approach to demographic statistics. In 1662, he estimated London's population, encompassing the City of London, the Liberties, Westminster, and the out parishes, at approximately 384,000. This figure was derived from weekly published bills of mortality, kind of like the obituaries. By 1665, Graunt revised this estimate upwards to 460,000, though other contemporaries speculated higher numbers, such as the French ambassador who suggested 600,000, though these higher estimates lacked empirical support. In this era, there was no legal obligation to report deaths to the authorities. Instead, each parish designated 2 or more searchers of the dead, as they were called in official title, tasked with inspecting corpses to determine the cause of death. Searchers, often destitute elderly women reliant on the parish for support, charged families a small fee for each death that was reported. Their role was complicated by their frequent illiteracy and limited medical knowledge, which, paired with potential dishonesty, could skew mortality data. Typically notified by local sextons or the tolling of church bells, these searchers were excluded from official records if deaths were not reported to a church, as was often the case with non-Anglicans or Jews. During plague outbreaks, searchers were required to isolate themselves, carrying a white stick when outdoors to signal their role and avoid contact with the general population to prevent disease spread. They reported their findings to the parish clerk, who then relayed the information to the company of parish clerks, the Lord Mayor, and, when the plague became a matter of more national concern, the Minister of the State. This data informed the bills of mortality, which listed weekly death totals by parish, including deaths attributed to the plague. John Graunt criticized the searchers' frequent misidentification of diseases, noting their propensity to report deaths as due to consumption rather than other recognized diseases. He observed that the promise of a cup of ale and a doubled fee could persuade a searcher to alter death records to suit a household's preference, particularly to avoid the stigma of the plague. As the plague intensified, the government implemented a quarantine system, sealing affected houses for 40 days, a measure that often resulted in additional deaths of inhabitants from neglect. Houses with plague victims were marked with a red cross, and the words, "Lord have mercy on us," with a watchman posted outside. Although official records cited 68,596 plague deaths, Grant suggested that the actual numbers could exceed official accounts by at least 30,000, indicating significant underreporting and the system's limitations in capturing the epidemic's true scale. The system of using searchers to report causes of death continued until 1836, reflecting long-standing practices in managing public health data. As reports of plague circulated through Europe in the 1660s, England had become increasingly concerned about the potential for the disease to spread across its borders. The Privy Council, recognizing the threat posed by international trade and travel, revisited historical quarantine measures that, in the past, had proven to be somewhat effective. By November 1663, following reports of plague in Amsterdam and Hamburg, the Council reinstated quarantine protocols for ships that were arriving in London. 2 naval vessels were tasked with patrolling the Thames estuary to intercept any incoming ships. Those coming from ports known to be infected were required to anchor at Hole Haven on Canvey Island and undergo a Trentine, a 30-day isolation period. Only after this period could these ships proceed upriver. To ensure compliance, ships that completed their isolation or originated from ports not affected by the plague were issued with a certificate of health, allowing them to continue their journey. Additionally, a secondary inspection line was established between the forts at Tilbury on the north bank and Gravesend on the south bank of the Thames. This line served to check and pass only those ships carrying the necessary health certification. As the situation on the continent deteriorated, the quarantine period was extended in May 1664 from 30 days to 40 days. The geographical scope of the quarantine was also expanded to include ships arriving from Holland, Zeeland, and Friesland, regions within the Dutch Republic that were heavily impacted by the plague. Conversely, restrictions on ships from Hamburg were lifted in November of that year as the situation in that area improved somewhat. Starting in May, quarantine measures were similarly implemented in 29 other British ports, beginning with Great Yarmouth. These measures, though critical for public health, sparked diplomatic tensions, particularly with the Dutch Republic. The Dutch ambassador protested the severe constraints placed on trade. However, England maintained that his actions were justified and necessary, noting that it had been one of the last countries to impose such strict measures. The enforcement of these regulations was rigorous. Any individual or household found to have allowed voyagers to come ashore without completing the mandatory quarantine was themselves subjected to a 40-day quarantine. This strict adherence to quarantine protocols shows the seriousness with which England approached the threat of the plague, prioritizing public health over the inconveniences to trade and international relations. The regular publication of the aforementioned bills of mortality had already begun in 1603, the year which recorded that staggering death toll of 33,000 deaths due to the plague. From then until 1665, there were only 4 years without any recorded cases of the plague at all. The severity of the situation was highlighted in various years. 1563 witnessed 1,000 deaths weekly in London. 1593 saw 15,000 deaths. 1625, a particularly devastating outbreak with 41,000 deaths, which was referred to at the time as the Great Plague, until the even more severe epidemic that we find ourselves speaking of now in 1665. Also, between 1640 and 46, there were 11,000 deaths, peaking in 1647 with a total of 3,597. These figures, while officially recorded, are generally considered underestimations of the actual death tolls. Now, plague was sufficiently rare that many medicinal practitioners of the time might have never encountered it firsthand. The medical community was of course diverse, ranging from university-educated physicians to apothecaries who often took on medical roles, to outright charlatans. It was fairly easy to fake a degree back then. This varied medical expertise, combined with other prevalent diseases such as smallpox outbreak the previous year, complicated the accurate diagnosis and understanding of the epidemic's beginnings. Reports from the winter of 1664 to 65 noted several cases of the plague, some fatal and others less severe, suggesting the initial occurrences of the disease. And that winter was particularly harsh, with prolonged periods of frost from December to March, and the Thames freezing over twice, conditions that likely slowed the spread of the disease. The 1665 plague is believed to have been introduced to England from the Netherlands originally, where the disease had been occurring sporadically since 1599. It is suspected that the initial contagion arrived via Dutch trading ships carrying cotton from Amsterdam, which suffered a severe outbreak in 1663, resulting in approximately 50,000 deaths. The first English areas to be affected were likely the dockside districts and the parish of St. Giles in London, areas characterized by high densities of poor workers living in substandard, slum-like conditions. In St. Giles, 2 deaths in 1664 and 1 in February of 1665 were noted but not officially recorded as plague-related. Thus, no immediate action was taken. However, by the first 4 months of 1665, the overall mortality in London began to climb, and climb significantly. By the end of April 1665, official records indicated only 4 plague deaths, 2 of which were in St. Giles. Yet, interestingly, the total weekly death toll had risen from about 290 to 398. Something was definitely not adding up. Well, despite just 3 official cases of plague in April, a number that in previous years would not have prompted significant action, the Privy Council now chose to implement household quarantines. Middlesex justices of the peace were directed to inspect suspected cases and enforce quarantine measures on confirmed ones. Similar directives were soon extended to the City and Liberties by the King's Bench. The enforcement of these measures led to unrest in St. Giles, where the community reacted violently to the sealing of the first house. A riot ensued. The door was broken down, and the quarantined inhabitants were freed. Well, the rioters, of course, faced harsh penalties for this. Additionally, instructions were issued to construct pest houses, isolated hospitals intended to treat or contain the sick. This swift government response, despite the initially low number of recorded cases, indicated a recognition of the outbreak's potential severity. I'm sure you're thinking by now how history repeats itself. Isn't it funny how in medieval times they were doing all of this? Well, as spring warmed into summer, the plague began to grip London more tightly. In the week spanning May 2nd to May the 9th, the parish of St. Giles recorded 3 deaths, with nearby St. Clement Danes reporting 4, and 1 death each in St. Andrew Holborn and St. Mary Woolchurch Hall, the latter being the only case recorded within the city walls at the time. The growing concern prompted the Privy Council to form a committee dedicated to exploring effective plague prevention strategies. As part of their initial measures, they decided to close several alehouses in the affected districts and impose restrictions on the number of lodgers per household to prevent overcrowding. In response to the escalating situation, the Lord Mayor of London issued a proclamation mandating that all householders were responsible for keeping the streets outside their homes clean, a duty traditionally upheld by the homeowners themselves rather than the city authorities, who employed scavengers and rakers to manage only the most severe refuse issues. As the situation deteriorated, city aldermen were tasked with identifying and penalizing those who neglected this responsibility. The situation in St. Giles, where cases were particularly rising, led to more drastic measures. The area was effectively quarantined, with constables given orders to scrutinize anybody who was attempting to leave. They were to detain vagrants and anyone they suspected of carrying the plague. This period of increasing dread is captured vividly in the diaries of Samuel Pepys, a senior Admiralty official. His entries provide a crucial eyewitness to the account of the plague's impact, and on April 30th of that year, 1665, he noted the palpable fear gripping the city, writing, "Great fears of the sickness here in the city, it being said that 2 or 3 houses are already shut up. God preserve us all." Another significant literary source that offers insights into this grim period is Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, published almost 50 years after the event in 1722. And although Defoe was only 5 years old at the time, his narrative was enriched by the personal experience of his family members and interviews with survivors. But here is one account from a Puritan minister who was there witnessing all of this. His name was Thomas Vincent, and this is what he had wrote. "It was in the month of May that the plague had first was taken notice of. Our bill of mortality did let us know but of 3 which died of the disease in the whole year before. But in the beginning of May, the bill tells us of 9. fear quickly begins to creep upon people's hearts. Great thoughts and discourse there is in town about the plague, and they cast it in their minds whether they should go if the plague should increase. Yet, when the next week's bill signifieth to them the disease from 9 to 3, their minds are something appeased. Discourse of that subject cools, fears are hushed, and hopes take place. That the black cloud did but threaten, and give a few drops, but the wind would drive it away. But when in the next bill the number of the dead by the plague is mounted from 3 to 14, and in the next to 17, and in the next to 43, the disease begins so much to increase and disperse. Now, secure sinners begin to be startled, and those who would have slept at quiet still in their nests are unwillingly awakened. End of the account from Thomas Vincent. By July 1665, the plague had engulfed the entire city of London, causing widespread panic and chaos. The affluent, including King Charles II, his family and his court, of course, hastily vacated the city. Initially retreating to Salisbury, they relocated to Oxford in September following reports of plague cases in Salisbury. In stark contrast, many of the city's officials, including the alderman and the Lord Mayor Sir John Lawrence, chose to voluntarily remain at their posts, facing the epidemic head-on. Credit where it's due, of course. The mass exodus of the wealthy was vividly described by Daniel Defoe in later times, who recounted scenes of carts and wagons laden with goods and families, coaches filled with the gentry and horsemen in tow, all rushing away from the plague-stricken city. As businesses shuttered with the departure of merchants and professionals, the city's economic life sharply declined. But hey, with all those rich people fleeing the city, I'm sure there was opportunities for individuals to procure riches through other methods. While the crisis was further compounded by the departure of key health and spiritual leaders, Defoe lamented the absence of a significant number of clergymen, physicians, and apothecaries who were crucial in managing the escalating crisis. However, it was of course not just the affluent who sought refuge. The poorer residents, too, were equally as terrified, and many attempted to flee. Yet, unlike the wealthy, the poorer faced considerable obstacles in leaving. The city authorities required anyone leaving to possess a health certificate signed by the Lord Mayor, which grew increasingly difficult to secure as the epidemic worsened. Of course, the rich always have their way of procuring certificates, but the impoverished had little choice but to leave behind their homes and means of livelihood, facing an uncertain future. As the summer progressed and the death toll rose, the situation became dire for these refugees. Villagers outside of London, initially receptive, began to resist the influx of displaced city dwellers, fearing the spread of the contagion. With or without health certificates, these individuals were often turned away at village boundaries, forced to avoid towns, and traverse the countryside. Lacking shelter or resources, many resorted to scavenging and theft to survive. Tragically, numerous refugees perished under harsh conditions of starvation and dehydration during the exceptionally hot summer, their fates marked by desperation and sorrow. Definitely backed into a corner, weren't they? Feel sorry for them. Well, by the end of July 1665, the plague had reached catastrophic levels in London. The weekly bill of mortality recorded a staggering 3,014 deaths, with 2,020 of them attributed to the plague, although these figures likely underrepresent the actual death toll. In comparison, deaths in other years during the same period typically totaled around 300, so this was pretty much 10 times as worse. As the epidemic escalated, London's traditional burial grounds were of course quickly overflowed, prompting the grim necessity for mass graves. Cart drivers roamed the streets with the chilling call of "Bring out your dead," collecting bodies to be dumped in communal pits. The sheer volume of deaths overwhelmed the city's capacity to manage the crisis discreetly. Initially, authorities mandated that the removal and burial of bodies occur only at night to prevent public panic. However, the death toll soon outpaced the availability of cart drivers, leading to corpses piling up against house walls. Necessity forced a return to daytime collection, and the burial pits swelled with decomposing bodies. In the parish of Aldgate, workers dug a massive grave near the churchyard, 50 feet long and 20 feet wide. This process continued, with labourers digging at one end while bodies were dumped at the other. Eventually, the pit was extended downwards until it reached groundwater at 20 feet, ultimately containing 1,114 corpses. The streets were haunted by plague doctors, many lacking any formal medical training, who attempted to diagnose and treat the afflicted the best way they could. Despite organized efforts by city officials who hired physicians and structured burial operations, the rapid spread of the disease fueled widespread panic. Misunderstandings about the plague's transmission led to drastic measures. The city corporation ordered the killing of countless dogs and cats, mistakenly believing that they might carry the disease. This action inadvertently may have prolonged the outbreak by reducing the natural predators of rats that carried the plague-bearing fleas. Authorities also advocated for environmental remedies based on the miasma theory, which posited that bad air spread the disease. Well, giant bonfires were lit in the streets, and residents were instructed to keep their home fires burning continuously in the hopes of purifying the air. Additionally, tobacco was widely believed to be a preventative measure against the plague, leading to the anecdotal observation that no tobacconist in London had succumbed to the disease during the outbreak. As the plague continued to ravage London, the city's economic and social structures nearly collapsed. Samuel Pepys, in his detailed diary entries, captured the desolation of the city thusly: "Lord, how empty the streets are, and how melancholy! So many poor sick people in the streets full of sores. In Westminster, There is never a physician, and but one apothecary left, all being dead. This account reflects the dire circumstances as the once bustling streets of London were left deserted, save for the dead carts collecting the bodies and the few dying victims visible on the streets. Despite the chaos, starvation was largely averted, thanks to proactive measures taken by Sir John Lawrence and the Corporation of London. They implemented a policy whereby a commission of 1 farthing was added to the price of every quarter of corn landed at the Port of London. This slight increase in grain prices ensured a steady supply and helped sustain the population during the epidemic. Furthermore, the surrounding villages, cut off from their usual markets in the capital, adapted by leaving vegetables at designated market areas on the outskirts of the city. Transactions were conducted from a distance with vendors, shouting prices to avoid direct contact, and payments were made by leaving coins in buckets of vinegar, believed to be a disinfectant. The recorded death toll, as per official sources, escalated over the summer months, rising from around 2,000 deaths per week to over 7,000 deaths per week by September. But of course, the figures likely fall short of the actual numbers affected by the plague. The reliability of these records was compromised by the high mortality rate among sextons and parish clerks responsible for maintaining them. Additionally, certain communities like the Quakers did not cooperate with official record keeping, and many of the city's poorest residents were just thrown into mass graves without any formal record of their deaths. The scale of the epidemic is further obscured by the fact that only deaths were documented, with no records of those who contracted the plague and recovered. Moreover, the subsequent Great Fire of London in 1066 destroyed many of the remaining records. In those few districts where records were preserved, documented plague deaths range from 30% to over 50% of the population, indicating the devastating impact of the disease where it was most intensely felt. Well, we have another passage from Thomas Vincent, yes, the one aforementioned. It goes like this. It was very dismal to behold the red crosses, and read in great letters, "Lord, have mercy upon us," on the doors, and the watchmen standing before them with halberds, people passing by them so gingerly, and with such fearful looks as if they had been lined with the enemies in ambush to destroy them. A man at the corner of Artillery Wall, that, as I judge through the dizziness of his head with the disease which seized upon him there, had dashed his face against the wall, and when I came by, he lay hanging with his body face over the rails, and bleeding upon the ground, and when I spoke to him, he could make no answer, but rattled in the throat, and, as I was informed, within half an hour died in that place. It would be endless to speak of what we have seen and heard, of some in their frenzy rising out of their beds and leaping about their rooms, others crying and roaring at their windows, some coming forth almost naked and running into the streets. Scarcely a day passed over my head for, I think, a month or more together, but I should hear of the death of some one or more that I knew. The first day that they were smitten, the next day some hopes of recovery, and the third day they were dead. The 1665 plague outbreak, while the most devastating in London, also left its mark on various other regions of England. One of the most poignant episodes occurred in the village of Eyam in Derbyshire. It is believed that the plague was introduced to Eyam by a merchant who received a parcel of cloth from London, unknowingly contaminated with the disease. Realizing the potential danger, the villagers of Eyam took the extraordinary step of self-imposing a quarantine to prevent the spread of the plague to neighboring areas. This act of self-sacrifice had dire consequences. Approximately a third of Eyam's population succumbed to the disease over the next 14 months. The plague also significantly impacted other regions, including Derby and Norwich, which experienced severe outbreaks. In contrast, the city of Bristol managed to mitigate the worst effects of the plague through diligent efforts by its city council. During the outbreak from April to September of 1666, Bristol maintained a relatively low death rate of about 0.6%. That's pretty good. This was a remarkable achievement given the rampant spread of the plague in many other cities during the same period. These varied responses highlight the different strategies and levels of success in managing the public health crisis. The story of Eyam in particular remains a testament to the extraordinary measures that some communities took to try to halt the spread of this devastating epidemic. Well, by the late autumn of 1665, the death toll from the plague in London had begun to wane, leading to February 1666, when it was deemed safe enough for King Charles II and his court to return to the city. This return sparked a resurgence of life in London. The gentry arrived in carriages, loaded with their possessions, and key societal functions resumed. Judges returned to Windsor to convene in Westminster Hall, and Parliament, adjourned since April of the previous year, finally reconvened in September of 1666. The city's streets and marketplaces, once emptied by the plague, once again buzzed with activity as trade rejuvenated and businesses finally reopened. London once again became a beacon for those seeking opportunity, leading Lord Clarendon to remark in March of 1666 on the city's restored vibrancy. While the plague's intensity had diminished, sporadic cases did persist into the mid-1666. The Great Fire of London, however, in September of that year, which devastated much of the city of London, was actually believed by some contemporaries to have helped extinguish the epidemic. I mean, you can't die from plague if you've died from the fire, right? Good logic. However, historical analysis, in hindsight, suggests the plague had largely receded before the fire occurred, with most post-fire plague cases reported in the suburbs and not the fire-ravaged city centre. Official records, like the bills of mortality, logged 68,596 plague deaths in London for 1665, though Lord Clarendon estimated the number could be double that. The countrywide death toll for the plague in that same year and the following year, 1666, was estimated by Dr. Thomas Gumble to be around 200,000. Thus, the plague of 1665 to 66 marked the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in Great Britain, with the last recorded plague death occurring around 1679. In terms of demographics, the population of England was around 5.25 million in 1650, but dropped to about 4.9 million in 1680, largely due to the plague and other diseases like smallpox. Urban centers, of course, notably more afflicted by the plague, relied heavily on continuous immigration from smaller towns and rural areas to replenish the populations. By 1667, London's population showed signs of recovery, with burial rates returning to pre-plague levels, and hearth tax returns indicating restored household numbers. John Graunt's analysis of baptism records further suggested a population rebound. This recovery was mirrored in cities like Colchester, which, despite suffering severe depopulation, saw its cloth manufacturing and overall population nearly returned to normal by 1674. However, not all towns fared as well. Ipswich, for example, experienced a population decline of 18% by 1674, which, in all fairness, could not solely be attributed to plague deaths. But, well, the plague certainly doesn't help attract any newcomers, doesn't it? Well, overall, the impact of the plague was significant but varied. While London recorded the highest death toll in a century, the proportion of deaths relative to the population was actually a lot less severe, at least compared to earlier epidemics in 1563, 1603, and 1625. Overall, approximately 2.5% of English population perished due to the plague during this period, which is, of course, not very good. Well, thank you very much for listening to that. Certainly some rather vivid descriptions of 17th century London. Would you like to live there? I don't think I would. I don't think I'd like to live in 21st century London, to be honest. I would like to thank my top-tier patrons and members, that is Britt, Charles, Tim, Wendy, Jeffrey, JC, and Stark Factory. Thank you very much for supporting the channel. If you would like to do so, then, well, have a look in the description. But I think that that's enough for one night. Thank you for joining me once again, and I will see you in the next exciting episode of ASMR Historian. Good night. Lots of hugs and kisses. Oh, and remember, wash your hands. See you tomorrow.